By this time, I imagine you all have seen the questions for the final. Uh, Now, although I assigned you chapters beyond it, I'm pretty much going to stop class at chapter 26. Chapter 26 goes from the Nixon administration through the Carter administration into the Reagan administration, and which that takes us up to about 1988 or so. And I prefer to stop around about that time because, to be honest with you, the closer you get to the present, the more it ceases to be history and the more it becomes politics. And the more it becomes politics, it becomes about opinions as opposed to facts. And also, once it becomes more about politics, I think that opinions kind of keep people from hearing uh, what a teacher is talking about. And so I want to keep it uh, only take it up to the Reagan administration because that ended uh, 33 years ago. 34 years ago now that it's 2022, and 33 years ago it ended in January of 1989, and so I'm going to keep it there. But anyway, as you all saw from the lecture on 1968 was a really pivotal turning point. It was a lot of stuff went on across the world. It was the year of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, where the United States really ran across a really determined and well-trained Vietnamese army that clearly wasn't going to be a pushover. Also, that was the year when you had the assassinations of Dr. King and also of Robert Kennedy. Now, the the climatic thing of that year, of course, was that you had a presidential election, and Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States. Now, this is significant because, if you go back to 1932 during the Depression, from 1932 to 1969, there had been one Republican administration. That was the Eisenhower administration. Uh, Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was a war hero. He led the American forces in Europe during World War II. Matter of fact, actually, he was actually the overall commander, and so he was a great war hero. And so that gave him an appeal that went beyond a political party. But overall, the period from 1932 to 1968 was a period when progressive politics were dominant. Uh, uh, FDR becomes president. He initiates the New Deal. The New Deal brings about a number of significant social reforms. Uh, we see, for instance, that labor unions reached their highest peak in the United States history. In the period immediately after World War II, going into the early 1950s, about 3 out of every 10 workers in the United States is in a union. Nowadays, there's been a slight resurgence in unions, but it's still under 10%. I mean, there's been a massive decrease. Also, in the period from the Great Depression through World War II to the 1950s, the United States came out of World War II with the world's biggest economy, the world's richest country by far. And the United States, along with the Soviet Union, emerged as the world's two superpowers. I mean, the other major powers of Europe were really damaged during the war, and of course, Germany was utterly defeated and split in two. And so that left the United States and the Soviet Union as the two major powers. And overall, there was a movement towards progressivism. Countries that had been colonized became independent. There was a movement towards increasing rights. For instance, as I've already mentioned, we see in the civil rights movement that political rights and individual rights for African Americans that had really been undermined going back to the ending of Reconstruction on into the beginning of the 20th century, that we see that in the 1950s through the 1960s. African Americans were able to regain these political rights, through the work of the civil rights movement. However, there was resistance to this. There, one of the things we see is that a number of groups who felt that their interests had not been paid attention to. African Americans, we see various women's movements starting, and some of this, for instance, with birth control was aided by uh, changes in technology. Eventually, we see the emergence of what we nowadays call LGBTQ groups who wanted legality and recognition for same sex relationships or for people who did not see themselves as binary. That language was not the language that was used in the 1960s. But what was then called the gay liberation movement did lead the way for the LGBTQ movement. Now, at the same time, there was a lot of resistance to these ideas. Um, Now, in the 60s, a lot of the resistance centered around issues of race. Uh, there was a very strong effort against the civil rights movement, but that effort was eventually overcome. And, and there were legal and Supreme Court decisions that solidified civil rights gains. And those gains have been very strong for the last uh, almost 50 years. Nowadays, however, we're in an environment now where it appears some of these rights are in a position of eroding. But at the time, back going in the 1960s, it looked as if these changes were permanent. Now, one of the things I hope you learn in history is that probably nothing is really permanent. People think that things change and that's the way it's going to be forever. Um, and maybe in their lifetime, it does. If since human beings only live so long, maybe in a lifetime those changes are practically forever because that's the way things are during your life. But over the course of time, things can change. And right now we're living through a period of tumult, and significant change. And we don't know how it's going to end. But the thing to understand is that a lot of what we see going on now we can trace back to 1968 and into the period that goes beyond it. Like I said, we're going to be looking in this chapter, basically from about 1968 to about 1988. Now, as I said before, issues around race were a big issue of controversy. But what we see is by the end of the 1960s, and after various Supreme Court decisions and after various laws were passed, from a political standpoint and from a practical standpoint, issues on civil rights were pretty much settled. That, segregation was gone, there was going to be integration of schools, there would no longer be a legal basis for discrimination in housing. There have been court decisions like Loving versus Loving that legalized interracial marriage. And so the kind of open and obvious discrimination that had taken place from the end of Reconstruction and had been formalized with Plessy versus Reagan in 1896 was now out of the window. That was no longer an option. And so what we see is that conservative groups really begin to coalesce around other issues. Issues, for instance, like abortion, which initially had not been a real big issue, became a big issue. And this is because, there were court decisions, Roe versus Wade, or Roe versus Wade, which came out, and, that final decision was in 1972. And, it made it legal for women to request abortion. And this was based on the right to privacy. This is a right that's not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but the argument was that fundamentally citizens enjoy the right to privacy, that beyond a certain level, the government should not be in your business. If a person decides to have an abortion or not, if a person is engaged in a non-binary uh, romantic relationship. I mean, these matters of, basically matters of the heart, matters of the bedroom, were things that the government did not need to be involved in. assuming you have consenting adults. But this became an area of controversy for some conservatives. Now, especially those with religious backgrounds. Now, of course, the other thing that had been a major aspect of the conservative movement was the fight against communism. You know, the Cold War was still going on. The Soviet Union was still very strong. And so there was always still a strong fight against communism. Now, you no longer had the Red Scares, the kind of thing that went on in the 50s. But there still was a Cold War. You know, the Vietnam War, the Korean War manifested that struggle. Now, the problem, of course, is that, you know, Vietnam and Korea showed that, you know, although these wars involved the Cold War, there were also issues of nationalism, you know, especially in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong had fought against the French, and they wanted an independent country. And to them, communism was attractive because, in their mind, you know, they looked at the French and the Americans, who were supposedly democratic. And I say supposedly because, in their view, they didn't really live up to it. You know, they say, we look, the people who help us are our friends, and so they moved in a Marxist direction. And you know, this is something that America and the West has been dealing with ever since, really, because you know, if you look at, for instance, issues in the Middle East that have gone on over the last 35, 40 years, we see that people in that part of the world, you know, have very different ideas of how society should be organized in the West. And, you know, what the West quite often sees as liberating is something that does not necessarily go over well with them. But anyway, I don't want to get too far off of that. But the bottom line is that you have a conservative movement emerging. And then also, I think that among everyday American citizens, and I say, and really that's kind of a misleading term, but I would say really among, you know, to be blunt with it, the white majority. A lot of people really felt that their interests weren't being met, that they felt that, you know, society as they felt it should be was being undermined. And you know, this is one of the great problems in American history, is that we see that from time to time there are movements to have major change. You know, we started this class talking about the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And people pretty much all agree, you know, slavery is a bad thing. We need to get rid of that. But the actual establishment of equality turned out to be a lot of work. And it went beyond just saying, you know, slavery's bad. You know, it became obvious that a lot of things needed to change. And once that becomes obvious, enthusiasm kind of dies off. And the same thing would happen 80 years later, 90 years later with the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, people say, you know, most people agree that open discrimination, segregation, denying people the right to vote, they agree those things weren't good. But inevitably, demands for equality went beyond, you know, the obvious criticism of segregation, went beyond the obvious injustice of Jim Crow, and especially when it came to the North. And so what we see is that for a lot of people in the North, a lot of whites in the North, you know, even somebody like George Wallace, you know, all of a sudden became pretty attractive, you know, in places like Michigan, or, for instance, in the St. Louis area, where you had a lot of working class white people, and, you know, who lived either in big cities like St. Louis or Detroit, or who lived in cities around them. They said, well, you know, look, the cities are falling apart, you know, there are crime issues, this kind of thing, you know, our communities aren't being looked after. Or, for instance, when they saw, like after the killing of Dr. King, or when there were a number of disturbances over police violence, a lot of people said, well, you know, look, these people don't respect the police, they want to have crime, you know, these were the perceptions that people had. And so what we see is that politicians, you know, initially like George Wallace, picked up in 1968. But more importantly, Richard Nixon, who had been around a long time. Richard Nixon was a congressman from California. He became vice president under Eisenhower. He lost the 1960 election to Robert F. Kennedy. And at one period, it looked as though he was washed up in politics. But in 1968, he won because Nixon realized that he could appeal to those working class people, those working class whites, who felt that, all the revolutionary changes, were passing them by, that they really weren't being represented. And so Nixon came up with the concept of the silent majority. In other words, he said that, look, you have these people protesting in the streets, but the actual majority of Americans aren't really saying anything, but they're not really happy with the direction of the country. And so Richard Nixon was able to defeat Hubert Humphrey, who had been vice president under Lyndon Johnson, and he won the 1968 election. Now, the interesting thing about Nixon, however, is that now Nixon did do some things that were pretty conservative. Like, for instance, he tried to nominate some conservative judges who had openly supported segregation. Now, those judges' picks were rebuffed. But the interesting thing about Nixon is that although he was personally a conservative, he supported a lot of programs that nowadays would seem to be very, very liberal. I mean, Nixon supported affirmative action. Under Nixon, a lot of government programs expanded. Now, the point to be made here is that Nixon was conservative ideologically. His fundamental orientation was very different from that of LBJ, Johnson, who had come before him. But the thing to understand about government is that government is like a really big ship out on the ocean. The captain may turn directions of the ship. The ship is not going to turn automatically. It takes a while for a great big ship to change direction. And the United States government is like that. I mean, although Nixon was very much a conservative, it took him a while. Now, the thing that is also interesting about Nixon is that Nixon had promised that he was going to end the Vietnam War, because I said before, in 1968, the Tet Offensive had gotten really bad. And, it was clear to a lot of Americans that Vietnam was a really sticky situation and there wasn't going to be an easy way out. Now, one of the interesting things, however, is that actually during 1968, Nixon had his people contact the Vietnamese and actually undermined negotiations that were going on between the current government, the government of Johnson, and the North Vietnamese. Something that, is illegal and also traditionally was seen as unacceptable. Traditionally the idea was that politics ended once you got into international issues, and that it was not appropriate for political rivals to try to undermine their rivals in foreign affairs. And so, of course, Nixon did this in a very undercover kind of way, but he did it. However, Nixon, once he did come into power, he did some of his most long-lasting changes were political changes. Nixon, for instance, opened up relations with the People's Republic of China, what people used to refer to as Red China. And he eventually withdrew American recognition of Taiwan as the rightful government of China. Nixon pursued what was known as détente, or kind of a lessening of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And a lot of people argue that Nixon could do this because at the very beginning of his career as a young politician, Nixon had been one of the most hardcore anti-communists. He was basically kind of like a step behind Joe McCarthy in terms of being anti-communist. He wasn't like making up lies on people like McCarthy. But he was, very much an ardent anti-communist. And a lot of folks argue that because Nixon had such strong credentials as an anti-communist, it made it possible for him to cut deals with the Chinese and with the Soviets that a liberal Democrat would have been fried for, would have been really, really vilified for by more conservative members of Congress. And the thing you have to understand is that in the 60s and in the 70s, conservatism was not really connected with one party. You had conservative Democrats, you had conservative Republicans, you had liberal Democrats, you had liberal Republicans, and so if they didn't name, the Republican Party was more, generally speaking, was more oriented with the business community, and the Democrats had stronger ties with organized labor. But in terms of just purely being conservative or liberal, you had both ideologies or both approaches to government in both parties. Now, the thing, unfortunately, for Nixon that did him in was Watergate. Now, Watergate, basically started with his reelection campaign in 1972, and it's probably one of the greatest unforced errors. It is the greatest unforced error in American history. Because by all indications, Nixon was going to win the 1972 election in a landslide. He did win it in a landslide. I mean, basically, the only state he didn't carry was Massachusetts. And so the last thing on earth he needed to do was to have guys connected to him going to the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and bugging office or whatever they were going to do. But they were caught. And eventually it was proven that Nixon knew about it and that he worked to cover it up. As a matter of fact, he actually fired a number of people who would not shut down the investigation. Now, ultimately, once the evidence became really bad enough, leaders of the Republican Party came to Nixon and told him, said, look, man, if this comes up for a vote for impeachment, we're going to let you go. We're going to vote you out of office. And so Nixon resigned. And I remember I was like 14 years old at the time, and it was a big deal. Nobody had ever seen this before. Nixon made a speech. He got on a helicopter on the lawn of the White House. He flew off to his home back in California. Now, after that, we had President Ford, who's really interesting because he's the only president in American history who was not elected president or vice president. I mean, because Nixon's original vice president, Spiro Agnew, was convicted of crimes, and he had to step down. I mean, well, he got in trouble, and he was eventually convicted of crimes, and so he had to step down as vice president. President Ford, who had been a long-term member of Congress from Michigan, had been a football hero at the University of Michigan, went on to become a lawyer. He ran a pretty conservative administration, and by and large was liked by people. However, the thing that really hurt him is that early on in his administration, he pardoned Nixon, and people always felt that there was a backroom deal, that that Ford had promised Nixon he was going to pardon him, and so as a result of this, when it came time for him to actually run for election, he lost, and he lost to Jimmy Carter, who was governor of Georgia. And, Jimmy Carter's still alive. He's now the longest-lived president in American history. If he makes it to his birthday in this year, 2022, he'll be 98 years old. And, the next longest-living president, I think, was the first President Bush. No, Ronald Reagan made it to 94. I think the first President Bush made it to 92. And like I said, Jimmy Carter's currently 97. And like I said, if he makes it to his birthday this year, he'll be 98. And so he's the longest living president by several years. And so he's still among us. But now, Jimmy Carter's an interesting fellow because Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. He was from the South. But he was a pretty liberal Democrat. And now, once again, we're talking about coming out of Georgia. He wasn't a flaming liberal, but he definitely was a person who supported civil rights. He was supportive of change in the racial laws. And he was also very supportive of issues like women's rights, the right to choose. He was very much a personal liberal. Now, it's really interesting because he was the first, really, he was the first Deep South president in a long time. I mean, now, Johnson was from the South. He was from Texas. But, Texas is kind of an interesting state in that Texas is a southern state, but Texas is also a western state. And so a lot of people don't always think of Texas as being purely southern. But Jimmy Carter's from South Georgia. He was from Plains, Georgia. If you know Georgia, he was from the southwest part of Georgia where they grow a lot of peanuts. And it was also a cotton growing area, a majority black rural part of Georgia. And he was very unambiguously southern. And what we see is that, people liked him a lot, but he ended up really being a victim of economic circumstances. I mean, going back to the Nixon administration, the economy had started declining. As Eric Foner mentions in our book, the United States government in the decades after World War II had really encouraged a lot of investment in Asia and Europe in order to develop those economies again, and really in order to make sure that these governments did not move in the direction of communism. Now, that was very good from a national security standpoint, but what we see is that, for instance, in 1945, 1950, America had about 70, especially around about 1945 or so, America had 75% of the world's industrial capacity. I mean, the overwhelming amount of manufactured goods in the world were made in the United States. Now, this, looking back on it, was clearly going to be a temporary situation, because the reason America had so much of the world's industrial capacity, excuse me, largely was due to the fact that Europe and Asia had blown themselves up fighting World War II. And so inevitably, countries that had traditionally been strong manufacturing societies like Germany, Japan, and then also a number of new countries, it was inevitable that they were going to eat into America's share of the industrial market. And so what we see is that by 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, America has a trade deficit. Now, that's 51 years ago this year. Now, the interesting thing about it is that since that time, trade deficits have been common. I mean, really, I was like 11 in 71. And so really, ever since I've been old enough to know what a trade deficit was, America's had a trade deficit. And, I'm in my 60s now. And so, for a couple of generations, America has had trade deficits. Now, also what we see too is that because America has relatively high wages, manufacturing continued to leave the United States. And it's kind of interesting because, at one point, a lot of manufacturing left the North and went to the South where there weren't unions, or where unions were very weak. But what we've seen in the last 25 or 30 years, that even low-wage states in the Deep South ultimately ended up losing labor, and labor went overseas, primarily to Asia. And one of the interesting things we see nowadays, just to kind of get off subject for a minute, is that, even in Asia, for instance, we see jobs leaving China and going to Vietnam. We see, for instance, like when I was a kid in the 70s, people talked about Japanese motorcycles. Nowadays, a lot of the big Japanese companies, they actually have their bikes made in Thailand, or India has become a major market. Even German motorcycles like BMW have the engines actually made in China. And so the point to be made is that over the last 50 years, industrialization has spread all over the world. We even see, I shouldn't say even, but, for so long it didn't exist. But for instance, like there was a period of time, for instance, where the United States had a treaty arrangement with Kenya, for instance, and there was textile manufacturing there, and call centers, have been developed in Kenya. So what we see is that, all the continents of the world, Africa, Asia, uh, are beginning to see certain levels of industrialization, and also tech uh, jobs moving there. Well, anyway, this really starts to become obvious in the 70s. The world we see now really starts to become obvious in the 70s. And so, therefore, in an area like we live, places like Granite City Steel, places like the old Alcoa aluminum plant, right outside of East St. Louis, places like all those factories on the waterfront in St. Louis, those places start to go out of business. I mean, a place like, for instance, like National City, between East St. Louis and Brooklyn, we used to have all the slaughterhouses and meat processing. Uh, that begins to go out of business. Instead you have meat processing out in rural places now, in Iowa, Nebraska, places like that, or some smaller towns. Uh, and so the old manufacturing really kind of dries up. I mean, a good example of this, for instance, is that if we look in where in the area where we are here in the Metro East, the two biggest employees nowadays are Scott Air Force Base. Scott Air Force Base is the largest employer south of Springfield. And the second largest employer in our area is SIUE, where I work. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off the subject, but the point to be made is that you really have big changes in the economy. And you begin to have inflation. Now some of this was triggered by, for instance, the war in the Middle East war in 1973, and where you have a boycott. OPEC, shuts down oil, won't sell oil to the West, which makes oil prices go sky high, and that triggers inflation. And really, that was until the current inflation that we have now due to COVID, that was the worst inflation of my lifetime. I remember gas all of a sudden becoming really expensive, gas stations being shut down because of the oil. And, prices just really went high from the 70s into the 80s. Now, in this environment, Jimmy Carter was not able to get reelected. And the thing that really hurt him on top of it was the fact that there was a really nasty revolution that developed, and a really aggressive, I shouldn't say nasty, I should say a very, very aggressive revolution developed in Iran. It was an Islamist revolution, and it was really directly aimed at the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, who had been installed by the CIA back in the 1950s. And so Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers, really were very resentful of the United States. And so when the revolution really picked up steam, they overran the American embassy and took the Americans hostage. And Carter seemed unable to do anything about it. Now, he attempted a rescue mission, but that failed. And the Iranians really purposely, they had worked up a deal to let the hostages go, but they purposely would not let the hostages go until right after Reagan was sworn in. And so Reagan becomes president. Now, Ronald Reagan's really kind of an interesting guy because, as your book mentions, he starts off as a Democrat. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. But in the 50s, he becomes a spokesman for General Electric. And really, I think if anything else, he really was shaped by the Cold War and the Red Scare. One of the things about the Red Scare is that it really was rough on Hollywood. A lot of people in show business who had left-wing ties during the 1930s ended up getting run out of the business in the 1950s during the Red Scare. And so it made sense really for an actor to really move in a very conservative direction. And that's what Reagan did. And so what we see is that by the time you get into the 60s, Reagan is really on the extreme right wing. Basically, he's just a step away from hanging out with people like the John Birch Society. And we see that when you have the 1967 1964, excuse me, not 1967, excuse me, the 1964 presidential election, it is Ronald Reagan who nominates Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee that year, who was very, very badly beaten. But the interesting thing about it, and I mentioned this in another lecture, that Barry Goldwater was defeated by Johnson, but that becomes the very last election where Democrats ever get the majority of the white vote. Now, that election is 58 years ago this year, and no Democrat has gotten the majority of the white vote in a presidential election since. And so what we see is that Reagan really kind of was a cutting edge guy. Now, it's interesting because, Reagan took a lot of positions in the 60s that were very much at the opposite of the political movement at that time. He came out against the Civil Rights Act. He came out against fair housing. And basically, but his arguments, he did not make arguments in favor of racial superiority, but what he argued was that if an individual had a house, it was their property. If they didn't want to sell it to a person of color, they shouldn't have to. He couched his arguments in terms of individual rights. And this is very interesting because when he ran for office when he ran for president in 1980, after having been a successful governor in California, he was very famous for going to Neshoba County, Mississippi, which is where the famous civil rights killing of the three civil rights workers, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, took place. And he very famously said that he supported states' rights. And this was in 1980. This was like 15, 16 years after Schwerner and Goodman and Cheney were killed. And actually, the murderer, the man who would eventually be convicted for murdering them, had not been arrested yet. That man wouldn't be arrested until, maybe 20 years later. And so the fact that he came to Neshoba County, Mississippi, and he talked about states' rights, people very much saw that he was, kind of making a signal to Southern voters that, hey, I have sympathy for you. But Reagan was a smart politician. He realized he couldn't go any further than that. And so, because as I said before, by the time you get to the end of the 60s, the issues of segregation and that kind of thing had been settled, at least for that period of time. And he knew that he couldn't openly go around talking about that kind of thing if he wanted to. I don't know if he wanted to or not. I can't read his mind. I'm just looking at what he said. But he didn't go in that direction. But the thing that's really significant about Reagan is that unlike President Nixon, who had been elected 12 years earlier, Reagan actually did begin to shrink the federal government. Reagan began to actively cut back on social programs like welfare, food stamps. He began to really put a lot of money into the military. And so it is with Reagan that we begin to see a significant reorientation of social programs. And it's very significant that Reagan steps down in 1988, and in 1992, when a Democrat does get reelected, Bill Clinton makes it a point to really kind of continue some of the conservative policies of Reagan, even if he doesn't take them to the extreme, and even if he kind of softens the edges. He makes it clear that he's a new Democrat. And, really it's not until we get to the current president that we really see another Democratic president openly talk like a liberal. And so, it takes about 40 years. Now, the bottom line is that, Reagan does change things. And in particular, what we see is that, because Reagan is willing to put money into the military, he puts a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. And a lot of conservatives in particular, would argue that Reagan was a key factor in undermining the Soviet Union because they did not have the money to compete with the military spending that he did. Now, I think that Reagan does deserve credit for that, but I also think that, the Soviet economy in particular was always a very weak economy. And the only reason it functioned as long as it did because it was a command economy where the government basically told folks this is what we're going to produce, and if people don't have enough to eat or if people don't have enough clothes to wear, too bad, this is what we're going to do, because it was a command economy and not a market economy. But eventually, it collapsed, and so we do see at the end of the Reagan administration, we see the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, we also see a collapse of other things. I mean, like for instance, in Africa, South Africa collapses. Even though Reagan was actually pretty sympathetic to them, because, like the Soviets, they simply could no longer find the resources to hold on to apartheid. And so what we see is that, they actually start pulling back in the late 80s. And by 1990, which is after Reagan's term, Nelson Mandela comes out of jail and becomes independent. So, but the bottom line is that the Cold War ends at this time. And conservatives can pretty much argue that they won. And so that really becomes a great dividing line, a new chapter in American history. I hope this lecture was helpful to you.